Is everyone back? We can get seated. We can get started again.
We're going to start.
All right. We have up next. We have Samuel Sohmer, and I know that Samuel is currently at an internship at the Noetic Science Institute.
Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Institute of Noetic Sciences, and is very passionate about the current global crisis, and specifically, I think, committed to issues of animal cruelty and water issues, and is going to be talking about the Human Rite of Passage, exploring global crisis, regenerative practices, and the sacredness of all living beings. Very good, wonderful.
Big topic.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you being here. This has been an incredibly transformative last year for me, and culminating at the end of my time at CIIS. I realized that this has been a personal rite of passage, so thank you for witnessing that. So the human rite of passage, I thought it interesting to look at the etymology of the term rite. It's connected to the Latin ritus, and it's relatively benign, simply meaning a custom within a religious or ceremonial context. But if we can trace it further back to Sanskrit origin, the term rita, and this term means the lawful and regular order of the natural and true structures of cosmic, worldly, human, and ritual events. Sometimes it's translated in a simpler ways like world vision or even truth. So it seems to suggest that rites are like naturally embedded into cosmic nature, that there's a natural order of the way that things go. And we see this still even in human culture, in indigenous cultures. Okay. There is a facilitation from adolescence into adulthood. A young adolescent will healthily differentiate from society as a means of self-discovery. And upon completing whatever requisites are a part of that cultural tradition, they'll be ushered back into the whole of society, typically marked by an arduous or dangerous death and rebirth experience, like a death of the isolated self and a return to the wholeness of community. So in modern society, we see that we've largely lost these rites of passage. We no longer, on a large scale, facilitate adolescents back into community. So it could be said that we are a civilization, at least in Western culture, of adolescence, paralyzed in the state of late adolescence, exemplifying the traits of this stage, which are greed, power, competition, individualism. And because of this, we see that we're now in a preponderance of global crises, and we don't treat the earth in the way that these indigenous societies do. Within all societal domains, really, from education to religion to economics, politics, military is a big one. And the foundation for all of these traits is really this differentiating from, in this sense, the Earth Mother. Just as the indigenous child or adolescent differentiates from society, we've differentiated from the planet. So how do we hold all of this? Well, Joanna Macy contextualizes it in what she calls the Great Turning, which is a shift from business as usual into a new paradigm. And writer Bill Plotkin, in a book, Nature and the Human Soul, reformats this into what he calls the cultural rite of passage. So we could see this collection of global crises as a collective death and rebirth experience. So what do we put our attention to in this portal of transformation that we're experiencing? What arrests our attention? Well, Jung said that it's not imagining figures of light that brings one to enlightenment, but bringing the darkness into conscious reality. So what is our darkness? In this theme of differentiating, what is it that what is our cultural and environmental blind spot today? And I would say that it's the way in which we treat animals, the way in which we treat other living beings, and the extension of this to the way that we treat ourselves. can't see this very well, but this picture sort of exemplifies the fact that animal agriculture is the blind eye of this storm of global crises. It's currently the primary cause of climate change, with 51% of all global greenhouse emissions because of animal agriculture. Deforestation, 91% of the Amazon rainforest is deforested because of animal agriculture. It's the leading cause of species extinction, habitat destruction, ocean dead zones. We fish, 90 million fish out of the ocean every single year. A big one for California is water use. So Governor Brown is telling us that we need to cut our water use down by 25%, but the domestic water use is only 5% of total use. Animal agriculture is responsible for 55%. So there's clearly something out of balance with that. And there's an interesting fact that 1 pound of hamburger is equivalent to 660 gallons of water, which is essentially the same as showering straight for 2 months. So that's an interesting thing to consider. What we'll be focusing on primarily today is land use. So 45% of the Earth's land is currently covered by livestock, and 1/3 of the Earth's land is desertified because of this. In an area of about 1.5 acres, you can grow 37,000 pounds of plant food, and in the same amount of acreage, you can only grow 375 pounds of animal meat. So it's becoming incredibly unsustainable to continue these practices. This includes grass-fed and free-range animals as well. They actually require more land for production. So advocating that everyone eats sustainably, or at least grass-fed or free-range, is not necessarily something that our planet can even hold. So for me, and I'm sure a lot of us too, the real sadness of this practice is the way in which we treat animals. And I assure you this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's not really worth going into for the sake of this presentation, but put in cages hardly the size of their own bodies, milked endlessly, obviously not within their natural environments. And for me, one of the worst is the relationship between the female cow and her calf. So basically, on average, about 6 to 7 times in a cow's life, she's artificially inseminated for the sake of impregnation, so that she can produce milk. Her calf is taken away from her every single time for veal production, or to be raised into a production cow herself. So the mother cow will eventually die from mastitis in her udders, or be sent off to a slaughterhouse herself. So I read an article recently about, this is a very big thing for me. I read an article recently about the way in which we treat animals is an extension of the way that we treat ourselves. There have been some Holocaust survivors that actually have come out as writers and have explained like a relationship between the way they were treated in the Holocaust and the way that we treat animals. One particular survivor said, "I believe as long as man tortures and kills animals, he will torture and kill himself as well. And wars will be waged, for killing must be practiced and learned on a small scale." So it seems as if, at least in modern civilization, we've differentiated to such a degree that we have lost our own animal nature. And we've forgotten that it's really our relationship between, the relationship between us and other living beings that connects us to something larger. Joseph Campbell, in his book, Power of Myth, discusses the way in which ritual emerges through these relationships. So in the hunting myth, we found that humanity was finding a great level of guilt over taking other animals' lives. It was out of necessity at the time, but they were experiencing guilt, so they ritualized these experiences as a means of maintaining the sacredness of these beings. And what Joseph Campbell explains as the definition for ritual is something that connects us to a larger morphological field in ourselves. And what I feel like he's talking about, at least in the context of these relationships, is the earth. And we see that in pre-agricultural times, most societies are matriarchal. They worship the earth as goddess. And a particularly interesting example of this is fleshed out by ethnobotanist and psychedelic researcher Terence McKenna in a book, Food of the Gods. This is a site called Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük is one of the last matriarchal societies of our time. In this society, we see an interesting relationship that McKenna outlines, and that is between earth as goddess, worshipping cattle, and the mushroom. He primarily uses this as a means of positing a theory that as we moved out of the forests of Africa and into the savanna, we encountered these large grazing mammals, cattle. We created a sacred relationship with them as we moved around in their grazing patterns nomadically. And we invariably stumbled upon their poop. And we found on that Stropharia cubensis mushrooms. Out of curiosity, we ingested these and initially experienced heightened visual acuity. For a burgeoning nomadic and hunter-gatherer society, this was incredibly important. So we incorporated that into our diet. But because of their psychoactive nature, we also, as Terence McKenna suggests, this could have catalyzed the emergence of reflective consciousness. So in some way, if we take this with a grain of salt, but in some way, it could be that cattle showed us the way to our own reflective understanding of ourselves. Interestingly, this same culture, Çatalhöyük, being one of the last matriarchal societies of our time, is also one of the first patriarchal. So we see the dawn of agriculture at this position in history. This was a loss of matriarchy, a loss of earth as goddess, a loss of some of these plant teachers that we'd had as well. We begin seeing a differentiation from the living systems of the earth. So this is when monocrop farming began. And monocrop farming is sort of misunderstood now. It's obviously denigrating to the world on a whole, but it's a prioritization of annual crops. And annual crops are primarily for the purpose of nutrifying the soil to stabilize perennial ecosystems. So we started seeing a loss of biodiversity. If we move forward to today, the dominating annual agriculture has left us with this sort of stratified picture. We also see this as a time of domesticating animals. Taking them out of the sacred systems, the living systems of the earth, and domesticating them for the purpose of food, commodification, and workload. So if we move into the present moment, even if there were conscious ritual as a means of relating to these animals, we've certainly lost that now. We've certainly lost that in regard to our relationship with them and our relationship to the whole of the earth. In fact, our language supports this. The etymology of the term cattle is property. So it further supports the objectification of these beings, forgetting that they are also in need of the same love, care, and attention that we are. So getting into regenerative practices and what can we do about this? I was asked by somebody, like, why would people care about this in a culture that's predominantly led by these traits of late adolescence? Why would we care about the well-being of other animals? Well, at this point in history, it's really a matter of survival. I mean, realistically speaking, what we're finding through science and fields like permaculture is that you can't take animals and their roles off of the living systems of the earth and not expect huge problems as a result of that. So I see this as twofold. First is the obvious denigrating effects of animal agriculture now. And the second part of that is what has happened as a result of their loss in nature. So the way in which these living systems have been disrupted because the sacred role of these beings is no longer being served. So the question is, can we be accountable for what we've done and what we're doing? And can we assume the role that we've chosen but we haven't consciously accepted yet? And I see this role as consisting of two things, perhaps. The first is understanding that nature is inherently more complex than we could ever understand. And so this doesn't mean understanding this complexity. It simply means acknowledging and respecting it. Ecologist Alan Savory has a tool that he calls holistic management. And this form of management is a systems approach to resources. So we could maybe reformat that into stewards of holism or holistic acknowledgement, like understanding that we do not and cannot understand the full complexity of nature. The second is that we have domesticated these beings. They're now largely dependent on us for their survival. So we can't simply bring them back into the wild. As we saw earlier, there's not a lot of that wild left to bring them into. So what tools do we have? We need creative yet pragmatic and realistic tools. Permaculture is a burgeoning field that connects indigenous wisdom and advanced farming and science techniques as a means of working with the living systems of the earth, working with the patterns of time as a means of restoring ecosystems and fair share for all beings and all people. So we find restorative agriculture and regenerative farming as primary tools from this field of permaculture. So with this role and these tools, maybe we can look a little more at what we're facing now. So the same ecologist Alan Savory and permaculturist Mark Shepard describe what has happened as a result of the loss of large grazing mammals in our ecosystems today, what were originally called megafauna. So these beings existed in Neolithic times and moved across the grasslands, fertilizing the land with their excrement. So as a result of their overhunting, we've seen a large amount of these grasslands being desertified. Interestingly though, we have 60 to 90 billion large grazing mammals on the planet today, but they don't graze anymore. I mean, they're incarcerated in these areas, obviously not natural areas of land. No ecosystem restoration here, no sacred role being fulfilled. This is actually a pool of their excrement here. You can see in the top left corner, that's the last picture. See how big it is. Well, this is an interesting point because it's really this that can save our ecosystems. So it used to be thought that it was overgrazing and absence of rain that caused desertification. While these play somewhat of a role, we're finding, Alan Savory has found that there's a relationship between the absence of these grazing mammals and what he calls non-effective rainfall. So a large amount of these areas have the amount of rain that they need, but the rain falls, is not absorbed into the soil, runs off into streams and rivers, goes into the ocean and is no longer usable, no longer potable. So what happens if we bring these animals back into the grasslands in a holistically managed, planned grazing way that really allows them to fulfill this sacred role? Well, they fertilize. That's what they do best biologically. They poop and pee everywhere, and their excrement is highly potent fertilizer. So they fertilize the area, the soil nutrifies, rain falls, it's absorbed into the soil. You see the proliferation of perennial grasses. You can bring back in perennial plants, perennial shrubs, brambles, all the layers of a healthy perennial ecosystem. This is an example of, Alan Savory started this project in 1978, but you can see within about 20 years, an entire ecosystem has been rehabilitated. So you then have bioregional stability at this point, and you can bring in what's called an animal polyculture. This is an assemblage of animals that exist simultaneously together to maintain the balance of their own lives as well as these ecosystems. Interestingly, that's what we've domesticated. Pigs, chickens, goats, cows, all together is a perfect assemblage of animals that works in this animal polyculture. So one of the last things that's interesting about this relationship between cattle and bringing them back into the grasslands is we see a re-emergence of mycelium. Mycelium is the fungal network under the ground that connects ecosystems in regard to communication and stability. At the crosshairs of these mycelium, we find mushrooms. So in a sense, it's like resurrecting that ancient holy trinity of earth goddess, cattle, and the mushroom. And just briefly, in this time of rite of passage, in a culture of adolescence, we're going to need elders. And who better than the indigenous cultures and their plant traditions that really teach us how to die. And even biologically, mushrooms decompose death and facilitate it back into life.
Yeah, but let me finish.
We'll just wrap up here. So, yeah, something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that disconnecting from the earth body is really disconnecting from the human body. And that we've largely forgotten what it is to be a human being, or we've forgotten what it is to be a human being in relation to the earth. So this isn't going to be easy, and it's going to require a lot of sacrifice. The UN and the Dietary Commission Agency of the federal government of the US just released a report stating that the vegan diet is the best for the planet. And personally, I would suggest that the vegan diet is, if it's best for the earth body, then it's likely best for the human body as well. We're finding that this prioritization of annual agriculture, these plants don't give us all the dietary requirements that our body needs. So we may have deemed necessary the inclusion of more meat products to balance that out. But a combination of perennial and annual agriculture together is all that the human body needs to live on this planet in a sustainable way. So I'm going to end with an ancient Eastern spiritual way of being, ahimsa, which really is the spark of the divine existing in all living beings. So hurting another living being is truly hurting yourself. Thanks.
So I'm just grateful to have heard your presentation. And I wanted to open up for questions to the audience. Anybody has any questions for Samuel?
Are you taking any coursework outside of school on permaculture? And are you able to kind of spend some time at farms that practice?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I recently went to the Permaculture Conversions Conference in San Diego, and I'm in the process of really, for the first time, entering the land myself. And having grown up in cities and, you know, the cityscape, I don't have a lot of experience with the earth. But the last year or two of my life, I've been reconnecting in that way, and this just kind of came as a result of that. It was like tapping into the pain of the earth and realizing that my connection to it is first, and then perhaps I can be a steward in some way. So I'm going that direction.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's been the impact of animal agriculture is sort of not talked about enough, you know, like you were saying about, you know, how we're told not to water our lawns, and yet, like, eating meat has such an impact. And I'm curious, do you see there's a shift, like a particular point happening where that is getting more into the mainstream, or, you know, are there people starting to talk about it?
I think so for sure. I mean, I can only really see things through the lens of your own life. But I have gone through these massive transformation, and I've found that as a result of that, I've found this whole world, this whole culture of people that are moving in that direction. And that what we're finding at this time is that there's going to be massive polarity. There's going to be a side that supports veganism and this way of reconnecting with the land, and large opposition to that as well. So I think so. I think they say something like, 10% of the population would need to reach this diet of veganism for it to really push over. And I don't want to be overly pushy on that either. I think that we're learning, I'm learning how to live again, how to eat as a human being, how to operate in the material world, and we need compassion.
any other questions? I might have some more, but maybe for later. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.